La Visita Incómoda se trasladó a la Feria Internacional del Libro de Monterrey para conversar con la novelista, poeta y ensayista estadounidense Siri Hustvedt. A sus 67 años, Siri es una reconocida escritora y activista comprometida con causas sociales y particularmente muy comprometida con el feminismo. Algunos conocen a Hustvedt por ser la esposa de Paul Auster, aunque en realidad Siri tiene una obra propia que hoy la sitúa en la lista de escritores más importantes de los Estados Unidos. En el terreno de la ficción, Hustvedt es autora de novelas como Recuerdos del futuro, El verano sin nombres, Los ojos vendados, El hechizo de Lily Dall, Todo cuanto amé o Elegía para un americano. Bueno, y su obra, desde luego, se complementa también con importantes textos de poesía y ensayo. Hustvedt vino a la Feria Internacional del Libro en Monterrey a discutir sobre lo que implica la experiencia de ser mujer y escritora. Junto a la reconocida Carmen Bollosa y a la columnista Denise Dresser, Siri insistió mucho en que no desea que su escritura sea juzgada o etiquetada por su género, que no le gusta que le digan es una escritora mujer, porque nunca nadie dice es un escritor hombre. Esta postura quizás explique también por qué la escritora se negó a hablar de su esposo en el encuentro que sostuvo con los medios de comunicación en Monterrey durante su visita a la feria. A Paul nunca le han hecho una pregunta respecto a mí. Solo le hago saber eso, le dijo molesta, con razón, al periodista que le preguntó, por segunda vez, ya le habían preguntado, cuál era el libro escrito por su esposo que más le gustaba. Y ella pues les dijo, yo vine a hablar de mí, no de mi esposo. Y es que tanto él como ella son referencias importantes del canon literario occidental y en la actualidad se les percibe como una de las parejas más influyentes del mundo intelectual. No cualquier día tiene uno la posibilidad de platicar con una escritora como Siri Hustvedt. Los invito a seguir esta conversación en La Visita Incómoda y que nos acompañen en esta amena charla con una mente lúcida y brillante que ha dado y dará mucho de qué hablar.
Hi Siri, how's it going?
I'm fine, thank you.
It's nice to talk to you.
I'm
Nice
glad
see
to
you.
be here.
You know, I hate those journalists who interview someone, especially a writer, and who maybe never read
Oh, right.
his or her books.
It happens.
Yeah, I hate those journalists. I think, but today I'm that journalist,
Okay.
so I'm very embarrassed.
So I see you
So
have
I don't want
you
to
have
lie
the
to
books.
you that I read
Okay.
your work. I wish I had. But the idea of my program is to encourage people to read. So I would like you to sort of explain to tell us who you are.
Yes.
and,
well,
and how do you define
who
your
am I?
work?
Well, that's not actually so easy, but I
know.
have been publishing for a very long time. I wrote poetry in the beginning when I was a graduate student
Yes.
in New York at Columbia getting my PhD, but I was also writing poems, and I published my first poem in 1980 in the Paris Review, a
Wow.
literary journal in the United States. And after I finished my degree, I started writing a novel.
Uh-huh.
And that was published in 92, so I was in my 30s.
Because you're also a
And,
scientist, right? And you still write academic
so here
papers.
it is. So yes, so as I said, my degree, my PhD is in English literature.
Uh-huh.
But actually, while I was writing my dissertation on Charles Dickens,
Oh.
I got very interested in his use of pronouns.
Mm-hmm.
There's a wonderful line that gives you an indication. There's an old man in our mutual friend, his last finished book, who's a drunk.
Uh-huh.
Mr. Dolls. And he has a refrain that goes like this: circumstances over which had no control. He never uses the first person pronoun. Right? And so things, well, there's an obvious meaning to this. This man his eye is drowned, right? It's drowned in the alcohol. And the alcohol is, in a way, the circumstances that he can't control. But there are many other clues like that. At that time, I was reading an essay by the linguist Roman Jakobson. It's a famous essay, but in that he says that people who are suffering from aphasia, the language problems that, for example, a stroke victim can have, the first words to disappear are pronouns, and they're, of course, the last words that children learn. So this is a little bit of neurology, and I then started to read neurological case studies. So this is way back in the 1980s. I got my degree in 86. But it wasn't until the late 90s when there was a kind of explosion in brain research that most people remember. I mean, it had been going on for a while. But I started reading, and I met some people working in neuroscience, and one of them, a man named Mark Soames, invited me to be part of a group, and I kept reading. And at one point, I published a book called The Shaking Woman, or History of My Nerves. This is in the 2000s, after I had done lots of research in what for me are related fields, which is neurology, psychiatry, neuroscience, and psychoanalysis. So then I started to get asked to lecture at conferences in these various fields. So I have a little strange life in science, and now I teach a seminar at a medical school in New York, Weill Cornell Medical College. So I have a little appointment on. I'm a marginal person in the psychiatry department.
These two books are on mental health, right?
No. This is a novel.
Okay.
And it's true that the heroine has a psychotic break at the beginning of this novel, and it unfolds from there. But it's not really about mental health.
Okay. Okay. And this one?
And this is a non-fiction book that turns around a symptom I had of shaking that was undiagnosed.
I see.
And this started as a lecture at Columbia Medical School, actually. And
it's an essay.
It's a long essay that turns on all kinds of questions. How do we think about a symptom? And I took my own shaking that was unexplained and looked at it from multiple disciplines, right? So if you're a neuroscientist, how would you interpret this symptom in the brain? If you're a psychoanalyst, how would you relate it to the life of the patient, etc.? I'm the patient to myself, if you will, in the book.
Interesting.
I get to play both sides. And I talk about memory. It keeps moving. And I think of it as a funnel, so that here's the symptom. And by looking at it from different perspectives, you keep circling. But my hope is that the reader, you get closer and closer, but there's no final answer. The ambiguities that are created by the multiple disciplines, right? There's no, if you ask a question and you're only in one discipline, you may come up with a single answer. But if you're asking from many points of view, you're going to get some ambiguity there.
Siri, you came to Monterey to this fair.
Yes, I did.
You were in a discussion, a panel called "The Subversion of Women."
Yes.
And you had an interesting discussion on the role of women in society, and also on the fact that there were three of you are women writers, right, in this panel, and And you were saying like
We
you
also-
like
we also
to be identified.
No, we also said that I said that I've started using the word man writer
Uh-huh.
because I think by saying, well, he's a man writer, then we understand how masculinity has been framed as a universal and still is, right?
Yeah.
So
You
if
never say a man writer.
No, you never say it, right?
No.
So, but you say women writer, you say gay writer, you say a black writer, you know, all these different adjectives to define all writers except for white men.
Yeah. It's
Pretty
terrible.
much.
It's terrible.
So I think that, but you know, this is also a question of becoming conscious of what we do,
Uh-huh.
right? Because it's not just, you know, one's claimed identity, whatever that happens to be. I'm a woman writer or a man writer. It's that once you can point to something such as man writer, you can become conscious of what all of us have a tendency to do, whether we're male, female, or in between. We borrow those dominant concepts of the culture and use them in ways that can be harmful at times.
But is there a way in which women could be identified when they write? Is there a particular sort of contribution of
Yes.
I don't know how to call it, women writing or?
You know, it's really, I've been thinking about this for a long time. You know, is there something in a text that makes it feminine or masculine? And I think actually, no. If you were given just a text, there are times you just have to guess, right? Unless the person identifies the author inside the text itself. But I do think we have ways of thinking about femininity and masculinity, and I'll use two American writers. Henry James can be thought of as a feminine writer, and Gertrude Stein can be thought of as a masculine writer. And you know, it's the opposite of what they actually were in an embodied sense.
But there are a series of prejudices that women face when they write.
I think it's not only in writing, right? It goes across the board in life. Is that there's often an notion about women that it is soft. It's not, you know, hard. It's not rigorous. So even when a woman displays just as much, you know, let's say, intellect or imagination or what have you as a man, it has a tendency to be coded as something nevertheless softer. Or often I find, even though I've written very different kinds of work, very different kinds of books, I'm always being told that it's my life.
Oh yeah, and that happens more to women than to men.
Much more to women.
Oh,
I
yeah?
think that there's this idea that, you know, that men invent things and women just emote. And, you know, that's a crude thing.
Yeah.
But I do find it, and it comes back again and again, that somehow it's my life that I'm telling.
In the publishing industry, is it more difficult for women to publish than for men?
No, I don't think so. And in fact, if you look back at the history of literature, certainly in English, since mass literacy, a lot of women have been publishing. And in the 18th century, in England, there were probably more female novelists than male novelists. The problem has been that scholarship about literature usually would dump all the women from the history, right? So in the 70s, there were a lot of literary scholars who rediscovered you know, women. And this has happened in many languages. It's not only in English, right? But in Spanish and German and in Russian and other languages where there's a kind of recuperation of lost writers.
Siri, I understand you're a very political writer as well, and you have a political history, and you marched against the Vietnam War.
Yes, I'm so old. I marched against the Vietnam War.
That's nice.
True. Yes, you know, I do think that this has also run in historical periods that just as I felt when I was 14, 15, 16, during the Vietnam War, and also the birth of what was then called women's liberation in the United States, that I felt a kind of urgency that I felt again with growing authoritarianism, of course, the Trump regime, let's call it that, in the United States, that this has galvanized me to write more political articles. I'm part of an organization called Writers
Against Trump.
We've changed our name now. We're called Writers for Democratic Action. But we are trying to organize bookstores. We are organizing bookstores, readers, and writers to register voters for this upcoming election in the United States. Yeah.
Interesting. What's going on in? There's a resurgence of right-wing extremism everywhere in the world. It's not just Europe.
Yes.
It's not just the U.S. Now it's also South America, especially.
Yes.
Brazil.
Yes.
Has experienced this. Argentina has a strong right-wing movement now. Chile, Colombia. What's going on in
you know,
why?
There's a kind of, it's not the same. Nevertheless, there are echoes, but now they're very much global, of fascist movements in the 30s in Europe, where a form of populism, right-wing populism, was growing up. There were, and always are, some economic reasons for this. But what I think it is that growing pluralism of cultures with many diverse kinds of people in them, certain migrations, right? The movements of people from one place to another. The pandemic, most recently, has created tremendous fear. And what happens then is scapegoating, right? You find in a convenient other. The others change, right? If you think of Modi's India and the anti-Muslim feeling, this has been going on in Hindutva that was influenced by the Nazis in the 40s. And it's very, in the 30s and 40s, this is very strong now. So, and the world is smaller.
It's
smaller. I mean, in my aging years now, I have this real, almost visual impression of the world shrinking. And that so much of what happens one place influences what happens another place.
It's true.
Unlike when I was a child, I really felt, of course children feel that, the world is large. But nevertheless, the global culture was not as insistent. The technology was different. So the influences move very quickly from one place to another. And authoritarianism, I do think it is the greatest political danger of this moment.
How do you think the left is responding to this big challenge? I think they're because at least in part, the left is responsible for this rise of the conservatism, right?
Right.
Or you don't see it that way?
No, why would the left be responsible?
Because they've ruled and they haven't probably done a good job.
Well, the left has not really ruled in the United States, I have to say. I mean, in my country, since the 1970s, right? That was after the 60s, whatever you want to call it, inflagration of protest. The right, or what you call neoliberal forces, have been growing in the United States, as has income inequality. So what the left has a tendency to do is shoot each other arguing about, ideological points, when actually progressive forces, I think, should be very much united against anti-democratic forces. That's what we need. That means you have to forget your bitterness about, what a pure ideological position is, and unite with other people. Democracy is pluralism. It is tolerating other people, but there's a necessity to believe that democracy is a good thing.
Sure. Well, at least in Latin America, we've had left-wing governments.
Yes, I know.
And in parallel to this, we have a series of right-wing
reactions
against that, and they seem to become strong.
Yes.
It looks that they're becoming stronger and stronger.
I think, listen, in moments of crisis, what people want, not everyone, but many people want simple answers. And that kind of simplicity just about never works, right? Real answers are inevitably complex. And they also want people to blame, right? So the Nazis blamed the Jews and Sinti and Roma people and homosexuals, and they had a long list. And the right wing has a long list now.
For some reason, the right wing seems to be attractive for large groups of society.
I also think, this is about power. I mean, I know my own country better, of course, but I really feel that part of this problem, it is connected to whiteness and masculinity, and that, excuse me, white men who have really had the power still have it. But when they see other people being granted authority, so women, black and brown people, LGBTQ people, all of this is experienced not as inclusion, but as a threat to their power. Even when their power is not actually threatened, right?
But probably feminism is the biggest threat.
Well, feminism, I think, is a huge thing, and we have a tendency to leave it out of the equation, right? And I think it's important to understand how, many scholars are saying this, but how race, gender, and class are deeply entwined in these political dramas.
Siri, it's very nice to meet you.
It was a pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good luck in Mexico.
Thanks a lot.